Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
Don't Go in the Woods, Volume 3, Story 1. Years back, midsummer, I was camped in California on a placer claim I owned for years. Nice, isolated riverside camp, about 1/8 of a narrow dirt road mile off a paved road. That morning, about 3:30 a.m., my dog, a big brindle bit bull dingo cross, started barking at something in the brush near my camp, which woke me up. I rolled off my cot, slid on my boots, grabbed a flashlight and 12-gauge pump, and stepped out of my tent for a look-see, thinking it might be a bear. Turns out, my dog had a raccoon up a tree. Calmed the dog and tried to go back to sleep, but every time that raccoon tried to make an escape, my dog started barking again. Realizing I was not going to get more sleep, I got dressed, cranked up a lantern, the gas stove, and brewed a pot of coffee. No moon to speak of, and dark as a tomb. Thinking I needed to resupply with grub and fuel, why not go to a little block, Longtown, about 17 miles distant, treat myself to a nice lager-style cafe breakfast, top off the rig gas tank, fill the gas cans, buy groceries, and return to camp. So I secured my camp, loaded the empty gas cans in my rig, poured a fresh cup of coffee in a big insulated mug for the road, loaded the dog, and drove out to the little narrow paved road, still dark as a tomb, with a slight ground fog. I pulled out into the paved road, but realized I had caught my seatbelt strap in the door. So I stopped, opened the door, released the belt, and secured it around me. Just as I was about to put the rig in gear and go, in my rearview mirror I noticed a weird blue-yellow-red bunch of twinkling, spinning lights behind me, maybe 500 feet back. Whatever it was approaching fast. So I threw my rig in gear and pulled off to the side of the road. Whatever this thing was, it was approaching rapidly and looking to be floating about 4 or 5 feet off the ground. I reached down between the bucket seats, unholstered my .40 Glock. About that time my dog saw it coming and started barking. The closer it got, the weirder the flashing, pulsy, floating lights looked. As it closed on where I was, I thought it was going to ram into the back of my rig. The closer it got, the brighter it appeared. It came to a stop right outside my window, which was about halfway down. My dog was against the glass, in full rip your face off attack mode. I had a firm hand on the Glock in my lap. Outside my window was a hunchback, human-shaped bearded thing, with a weird-shaped elongated head, huge bug eyes, wearing some kind of weird fluorescent striped, skin-tight, spandex-looking outfit, screaming some unintelligible gibberish at me. It's a good thing I was calm and have a steady hand, otherwise, out of reflex, I would have shot it in the face. Between the dog going crazy inside my rig, this weird thing screaming outside, the only words I understood was "gold dredger." Suddenly, it took off and out in front of me into my headlights. It was then I realized it was a human on a high-tech, racing-type bicycle with spinning LED strobe lights all over it, even on the wheels, dressed in some kind of shiny racing suit with a weird-shaped helmet, wearing bug-eye looking goggles with a backpack on. Thinking, what the was that about? And why the hell was he screaming something about gold dredging? I decided to follow him at a safe distance, as I was going in the same direction anyway. There was several miles of downslope as the road followed the river going downstream. Man, this guy could go. He averaged about 40 or so miles per hour for several miles. I flashed my lights a few times while following about 100 yards behind him, to see if he would stop to talk, but he would not. He slowed as we approached where the little road intersected with a highway, and he pulled over into a large, off-the-highway pull-out and stopped. I pulled in behind him and stopped about 75 feet from him. I dropped the Glock into my coat pocket, got out, making sure my dog did not, and approached him. As I did, he positioned his bicycle between us, unhooked the tire pump off the bike, and was waving it over his head, screaming, "Mother Earth is sacred. Deer, water, and fish are sacred." I tried to speak with him, but he was having none of that. So I walked back to my rig, got in, wondering what the is this all about. That moment came along a commuter-type minibus, the kind set up for disabled people. This weirdo attached his bike to it, got in, and headed off down the road. I turned my rig around and headed off to a little town about 8 miles up the highway. As I entered a little town, I saw a sheriff's car with a deputy drinking coffee in it. I pulled over to him to make a verbal police report about the weirdo. The moment I said weirdo and bicycle, to the deputy said, "Willis, what's he done now?" I explained what happened. The deputy told me Willis was the black sheep son of a wealthy local family, an environmental wacko with both mental and drug problems, and lived in a yurt a few miles above my claim. 3 years back, he was throwing rocks at someone, gold dredging, and a rock hit one of the dredgers in the face, breaking out some front teeth. The two dredgers caught Willis, hog-tied him, and brought him to the sheriff's office to press charges. The judge sentenced Willis to 90 days in a mental evaluation place where he took up with some queers who turned him into one. Result was 4 years probation and 16 hours a week in a local drug and mental rehabilitation center. That's where he catches that bus to twice a week. Deputy said, "I guess it's time to report this to the judge, especially after the deer hunting thing." I asked, "What was that?" Deputy told me Willis would ride around on his bicycle following deer hunters, tooting a canned air horn to warn the deer and harass the hunters. Deputy said he was lucky he did not get shot. That year, I never saw Willis again. Next year, locals told me he had another run-in with some hunters, attacked one with a bicycle tire air pump, and this time the judge sent him to the nut house for good. You just never know what you'll run out to in the woods, especially at 4:30 in the morning. No words can describe my thoughts as those weird lights approached my rig in the dark, thinking, what the hell is this coming at me? Story number 2. I moved out to a remote area in Washington State about 14 years ago. Not totally the middle of nowhere, but you can see it from here. Anyhow, I have a little piece of land that I have cleared maybe 3/4 of an acre around the house and left the woods out back alone for the most part. My woods are home to everything from bears, cougars, bobcats, and coyotes. Most of the time I have lived here, I thought I was the king of these woods. However, I have been scared out of my own woods a few times since I came here, even with a loaded .45 or long gun in my hands. We don't usually concern ourselves too much with the wildlife here, and I don't harvest anything from my own woods, preferring to let them have my woods the sort of protected sanctuary. A few times we have been nervous about bear and cougars in the immediate vicinity, but unless they get too familiar here, I am not going to bother them. I've spent a lot of time in the woods, and I'm not easily spooked, especially if I'm armed. However, I believe strongly in my own instincts, as they have literally saved my butt a few times, so I listen to them when my hackles go up. One day out back, within 80 to 100 feet from the house, I was just sneaking through the woods early in the morning, looking for anything interesting I could find, when I heard some very solid and heavy tree knocks very close to where I was at. The underbrush was pretty thick, and I could not see further than 20 to 30 feet from where I was in any direction. I froze and waited, and again 3 very loud thunks. Sounded like someone hitting a tree with a huge axe or sledgehammer, or a basketball-sized rock maybe? Anyhow, I had my .45 in my waistband and very quickly had it in my hand. I did not know what was making that powerful knocking, but I did not wait around to see. I had the dignity not to run out of the woods, but I proceeded at a very fast pace back to the house. Another time, we were outside having a cold beverage at about 3 a.m. on a hot summer night when we heard a phenomenally long, drawn-out, primal howl that came from a huge set of lungs. It seemed to be covering ground as it howled, and at first I thought it was a screaming motorcycle. Then the siren from the firehouse a few miles away. Then it undulated up into a shrill primal sound that was so drawn out to be impossible. Until it cycled up at the end. I was not sure what it was, but at that point it was obvious that it came from a set of big vocal cords and a set of lungs. After exchanging a quick "Did you hear that?" and a quick "Yup," we were up and heading for the door. In a few minutes we had laughed it off and went back out to listen some more. Within a few minutes a very large tree sounded like it was slammed to the ground with force not too far from the house. This was not a tree leisurely falling over. It was a wrenching and violent sound of a big piece of living wood being broken. That sent us back in the house again and for the rest of the night this time, and we spent a long time wondering what it was that we heard. Upon discussing this with my kids, who were 22 and 24, they told me they called it the Banshee, and that they heard it a few times, always late at night. Then, in August of 2012, I was coming up 8th Avenue out of Spanaway, Washington, driving along the boundary of Joint Base Lewis McChord, and I saw a huge male Sasquatch cross the road into the military base about 400 feet in front of me. I got a very good look at it as I had my brights on, and it was illuminated very well and for several seconds. Plenty of time for me to see it, do a double take and look again. Plenty of time to see and take in just how huge this thing was, being huge even for Sasquatch standards. It swiveled its upper body and turned to look at me and hurried off to the right. Needless to say, I was very disturbed. Did not even consider taking a picture. I kept right the heck on moving. I was sort of in shock, I think, because even having heard all of these things and living here in Sasquatch country, I was not a believer. I always figured there would be a body, there would be an irrevocable footage, there would be something substantial if it was real. It also occurred to me that there must be a breeding population, not just one, and that with it moving into the military base, that they must be aware of it with all the night ops and training they do all over this base. They have to know, and have proof of it. No way they don't have proof, in my opinion. Anyhow, I no longer feel secure with my guns in the wood. Having been camping since, and I keep out of my own woods and don't feel the need to hunt anymore either, to be honest, I still get goosebumps telling the story. I reported to an investigator that came to meet me with me and told me his first sighting was a very similar sized large male creature within a mile of where I saw it at. It took me a while to come out and tell folks about it, but when I did I was amazed how many folks had their own stories to tell. Amazing to think, but figured folks need to know that the big guy is out there and that it's no old Indian story to scare off the white folks. Sasquatch is real, and he's out there. Story number 3. When my eldest was a newborn, maybe a month old, we went camping off the beaten path in Greenwater, Washington. I'd gotten my old 1970 Cadillac Sedan DeVille with an old Airstream camper trailer behind it, about 27 miles up a barely passable dead-end logging road that a friend had told me about. Beautiful place it was, with a big rock slide area and a ravine beside it that was about 75 feet or so across. We were sitting on a handy log with a little fire going, and we were listening to a little battery-powered radio. The baby was in a car seat, and all was going well, when we started hearing some footsteps on the other side of the ravine. They seemingly stopped across from us. Then somebody let out a whoop, like they do on the Bigfoot shows. Sounded human to me. I was like, what the? It seemed I could hear some low sound like giggling and figured it was some kids. Then a rock as big as my fist landed a few feet from where we all were at, including my daughter. I snarled some coarse language across the ravine, and another rock hit my camper. I pulled out a Colt King Cobra 357 Magnum and randomly put 4 shots out into the dark, and I heard one ricocheting off into the dark. The muzzle flash from that Magnum was big and bright, and I heard those footsteps running off fast into the dark. I don't know who or what was over there messing with us in the dark, but that rock could have killed my kid. Not one to go randomly firing into the dark either, but out there that far out in the woods, there is no law and nobody to look out for you but yourself. Luckily, I was able to just start up the car and drive out of there. I did not want any trouble and sure didn't want to go any further with all of that. We camped on the side of the road later that night. Next story. Well, I have 2 stories. Once, when I was a teen, I went to my friend's place, ways out of town, and we went out on their ATVs. We were bombing around up and down trails, exploring old and new logging trails, racing, and generally having fun. At one point, I got away out ahead of them. Later found he got stuck for a bit. So, at a spot where an old logging road branched off, I spun the ATV around, took off my helmet and such, and waited. I would have gone after him, but I could hear him getting closer, so I waited knowing he'd head up the road because that was where we agreed to go. After many more minutes than I expected, Part of the engine noise I heard was apparently him getting unstuck. He comes roaring up the road toward me. About 20 feet away, he screeched to stop. I asked how he was doing. He said, "Don't move, but look behind you." Less than 10 feet behind me, there was a sort of berm. On it, and laying in the grass beneath it, was the largest collection of coyotes I have ever seen in one place, all different ages. They must have been there a while because some of them were lying on the ground. They had been sitting there watching me watch for him. I never heard them at all. They didn't even move as we started the ATVs and continued up the road. My heart was racing. I thought it was cool, but later was told they might have been sizing me up as lunch. The other creepy story I have is a ghost story. I went on a survival course one time where we spent an extended time in the bush. Once the actual test began, we were placed on our own in separate locations to make it on our own. Very first night, looking out over an expanse of water, swollen section cut out by a river, near my camp, I saw what looked like a campfire well off. I sort of took a compass bearing and tried to get some marker sites, thinking it was one of my classmates. Over the next 3 nights, I saw it every night. I figured it was a classmate, so the morning of the 5th day, I decided to set out foraging in that direction to see who it was. It took me hours to get in the area and a while to find it. It was a burned out log cabin. Long burned out. The dirt road to it had saplings growing all over it. I could find no sign of a camper, classmate, or any new fire of any kind. I was creeped out but not freaked out until on the way back I ran into one of the instructors doing a wellness check. I asked about it, and he told me the cabin had burned way before they were given access to the land. He had heard people died in the fire but had no evidence, just a rumor. Told me to stay away from it, and there were no students in that area. I got back to camp. It was getting dark, and I got my fire back up as it had been left to smolder and slow burn during the day. Eating some berries and a fish I'd foraged when I looked up and see the fire again. I go to the water's edge and take a real good bearing, definitely where the cabin is. That is when I realized it. The amount of fire I could see through the trees and at that distance was way too big to be a campfire. I got no sleep that night. Next story. Back about 13 or 14 years ago, a close friend of mine and I decided to hike out to this cave that he knew about. It really wasn't a cave, just some huge boulders that had fallen onto other boulders, making a cave-like structure. Well, we took off in the afternoon after school and hiked until almost dark. We were several miles away from anyone's house, walking on some abandoned railroad tracks. We kept hearing noises behind us, but didn't think much of it. As we hiked, we noticed a pink shirt hanging on a tree. Still didn't think much of it. We never found that cave that night and decided to make camp on the abandoned railroad ties. We heard strange noises all around our camp all night. All we had for protection were some decent-sized knives and BB guns. Needless to say, we didn't get much sleep that night. Just felt and sounded like something or someone was circling our sight. The next morning, we took off for home and went through a dried-up creek bed next to the river. Turned out the creek wasn't dry and we sunk up to our privates in mud. Took a while to get out, but once we did, we walked over to the river to wash off. Next to the river were human footprints, without shoes, just bare feet, out in the middle of nowhere. Freaked us out and we promptly left. As we continued our walk, we noticed the pink shirt hanging from a tree was no longer there. To this day, neither of us will go back out there unless we are armed with something more than a BB gun. Next story. Far away from any road, I found a small wooden flume with water running in it. I'd hiked in to inspect an old lode gold mine. Ran across a small, old patched V-shaped wooden flume with a pretty good head of water flowing in it, about the equivalent of what an 8-inch pipe would carry gravity flow. Really made me wonder who took the time, trouble, labor to patch it up and where it went. But I was on a schedule, so I stayed on track to get the job done. Job went quick, easy, finished, and was hiking back out. When I got to the flume, my curiosity got the best of me, and I followed its downflow to see where it went and the purpose it was being used for. Less than half a mile down, found an old placer gold workings, where a gully cut through a small old tertiary gravel channel. The flume was feeding water to a long sluice box, It appeared it was recently worked, but didn't see, sense, or feel anyone was around. I walked over to the sluice box, bent over to eyeball the riffles to see if they contained any placer gold. While bending over, I heard a lever-action rifle not very far from me. I froze, hair on my neck, stood up very slowly, raised my hands over my head, and turned around. About 40 feet distant, near a big tree, stood a stout, bearded, barrel-chested man about 60 some years of age, wearing work-stained bib overalls. The look on his face was that of a hawk looking at a rabbit in his claws. As I opened my mouth to speak, he loudly bellowed, "Git and stay gone," at me, motioning with the barrel of a Model 94 Winchester aimed in my direction. Without saying a word or lowering my hands, without completely turning my back on him, I walked half-assed sideways out of his sight, then turned and did a quick step out of rifle range. His steely eyes looked, and dead serious tone told me that was the wisest thing to do, rather than open my mouth and possibly get a bullet in it. Next story. This one occurred many years ago when I was a child. My family was traveling on US 340 in Maryland, close to Burkittsville. Yes, of Blair Witch fame. The area has a lot of farms, especially cattle. I was looking out the window at a stretch of pasture when I saw the most unusual sight. The cows were being chased by some kind of animal that I couldn't place. I can even remember how I was mentally trying to find a name for this thing even as we zipped by. The first thing that struck me about this thing was the size. Even from that distance, I had estimated to be about the size of a black bear, if not a little bigger. It was covered with very long dark hair. The animal was running on 4 legs, much the way a bear would. It was very broad in the body, and the head was small and distinctly canine, with a set of pointed ears that were flattened on the back of its head when they weren't twitching from sounds. I suppose traffic sounds? I didn't note a tail at all before we crested a hill and the scene disappeared. I suppose afterwards that it had to have been a dog of some kind, but I've had years of experience with dogs since, and I have never seen a breed that matches what I saw that day. The other thing I remember is that the cows were full out stampeding. I've seen herd dogs at work. This wasn't the same thing. Lord knows what it was, but I guess it'll have to remain a mystery for me. Next story. This didn't happen to me, but it was told to me by my ex, her dad who was there, and the guy that it happened to, my ex-brother-in-law. None of them were prone to tall tales, nor embellishing facts. About 3 decades ago in the Appalachian forest of central Pennsylvania, my brother-in-law was hunting whitetail during the early archery season. He, as well as all of his family, are avid outdoorsmen, hunting, fishing, trapping, boating, camping, etc. in all seasons. This particular brother-in-law was close friends with a well-known outdoorsman from books, documentaries, and his own TV show for many years, and was as home in the wilds as most folks are in their own living room. Late in the afternoon, he tagged a nice buck quite some distance from the cabin, so he quickly gutted it and began the long drag back, hoping to get to camp before dark. As he described it, about 15 minutes into his trek, he began to be aware of something behind him. The further he went, the more certain he became that whatever it was following his trail, in all probability locked onto the blood scent of the deer. He knew it was big due to the sounds he could hear in the brush and the occasional snort-like whoosh of air. He knew there were sightings of mountain lion in the area, and bear were fairly common, as was bobcat and wild dogs, but this just didn't seem to fit any of them. He quickened his pace, but not only did whatever was behind him keep up, it seemed to be closing the gap. Finally, he took a desperate gamble and threw the deer across his shoulder, and all but sprinted as best he could through the heavy brush and mountain laurel for the remaining quarter-mile or so to the camp. After he had covered about half the distance, behind him he heard a blood-curdling, howling scream from the approximate area where he had shouldered the deer. Heart racing and adrenaline pumping, he covered the remaining distance to the cabin in record time, even leaping across the creek while still carrying the buck. All the while, he could hear growls and screams mingled in with loud pops and cracks, almost like gunshots. At camp, the others had already returned and were standing outside listening to the commotion when he came running in. They quickly hung the deer in the shed, locked it, and then locked themselves in the cabin. The sounds continued on and off for close to an hour at different points around the cabin. Then everything went quiet. Needless to say, nobody slept very soundly that night. The next morning, they went to investigate the area where the original screaming and sounds had begun, hoping to identify the sign and from that the animal responsible. The ground was too hard and rocky for any conclusive tracks, but what they did find, not more than 15 yards from where he had shouldered the deer, none of them could explain. In the middle of a thick stand of mountain laurel, an area about 20 feet by 20 feet had been literally ripped apart. Laurel is a very tough, fibrous, bendy wood. It is almost impossible to break it. These were twisted and snapped as though they were brittle twigs. There were no claw marks, no teeth marks, no antler or horn marks, no saw or hatchet marks, just splintered, ripped, torn mountain laurel, some as thick as 2 inches. Whatever it was very big, very strong, and extremely mad. The area was torn apart in a fit of rage. Now, you tell me what it was. For my money, I'll bet on old Sass. Next story. I have a memory from when I was a child. We lived in another state in an old 2-story house. In this memory, I was looking out my bedroom window, which was on the 2nd floor and faced out into the backyard. It was night. The moon was very bright. It had been snowing, but the clouds were now gone, and the moon very bright, and the whole backyard was covered in smooth, fresh, undisturbed snow. It was sparkling in the moonlight, very still and beautiful. My father had gotten us kids some white rabbits, and they were in a long hutch at the back corner of the backyard. While I was standing there at the window looking out, I saw a dark figure emerge from a line of spruce trees and move toward the rabbit hutch. When I try to describe it now, I would have to say it resembled what I would call a werewolf. It was walking on 2 legs, but with difficulty, like it was hobbling on its legs, and it was holding its arms or front legs out in front of itself, and the arms were sort of moving up and down like it was trying to balance itself every step. The head was huge, sloping down like a bullet shape. It was too far away for me to see eyes or features, but it was the outline of the thing and the way it walked that was so scary. The memory of the way it moved, even now, is not like anything I have ever seen. As it walked, it sort of plowed up the snow, which was several inches deep. It went to the first door on the hutch, and after what seemed a long time opened it and took out a rabbit. I was scared, so I smacked the window with my hand and ran back to my bed and covered up my head. The next morning, my father came in from outside while we were having breakfast, and he told my mother. I buried it. Later on, I went out, and the first section of the rabbit hutch was empty, and the snow was all disturbed where I saw it come out from behind the spruce trees. Now, who or what it was that I saw, I don't know. I don't believe in werewolves, and it could simply be the false memories of a scared little girl. Next story. I remembered a story that a former co-worker shared with me. A few years ago, my co-worker, who I'll call Joey for privacy reasons, was out with his son and a Boy Scout troop on a weekend campout. They were on a large private patch of land somewhere near Front Royal, Virginia. Night fell, and the scouts were given the challenge of navigating at night. They were taken out into the woods to random spots and told to find their way back with map and the stars. Joe accompanied his son for his turn. Things started off well as they made their way through the forest. They were about halfway back when they became aware of the sound of footsteps off to one side. Joe hit his flashlight, and the beam caught a human form retreating from the light. Joe and company couldn't figure this out, but were concerned someone was trespassing. They decided to follow while Joe retrieved his firearm from his pack. They followed the sound a short distance until the footsteps were lost to the sound of a small creek. They approached the creek, hoping to find some tracks in the bank. Joe switched on his flashlight again. Standing in the beam of light was a young man, dressed in a dark blue Union uniform. He stared at Joe and his son until he disappeared into thin air. Joe and son beat it back to camp double time at that point. Around the fire, they questioned the organizers and the property owner to see if a trick had been pulled. The troop leader seemed as scared as they were. The property owner, however, gave a cryptic reply. I've seen him twice myself, the first time being nearly 50 years ago, and he hasn't aged a day. Next story. I grew up in Daytona Beach, Florida. Just outside of Daytona, there's an area called Tomoka. It's just a wooded area, not considered a national state park, with one main winding road in and out. No street lights, so it's pitch black out there. There are tons of old Indian ruins out there. Most of them are fenced off now. One night, about 10 years ago probably, my brother, his girlfriend at the time, and myself were driving out there at about 2 a.m. to go wander around the ruins. We were about halfway out to the ruin that had just been discovered a few weeks before, and my brother's girlfriend and I happened to look up into the trees that hung over the road, and I'm pretty sure we both said, "Holy crap," and just looked at my brother at the same time. What did we see? A little girl wearing a colonial-era dress hanging from the trees. My brother never did see the little girl. Needless to say, we never made it to the ruins that night. A few days later, we went back to explore the new ruin that was discovered, during the day I might add, and while we were there, my brother and his girlfriend were walking around the back side of the ruin. I was so freaked out because I felt like we were being watched and stayed out by the car. They heard a little girl giggling and walked towards the wood and saw a little girl, again wearing the same type of colonial-era dress, and she told them to come play with her and ran into the woods. My brother decided it would be a smart idea to follow her. He went a few hundred yards out but never did see or hear her again. There is also an old witch's house out in the same area. Every once in a while, if you drive by it at night, around midnight, you can see an old lady walking across the window. The house has been abandoned for years. Next story. Growing up, before my parents split up, I would always see a tall, thin, shadowy figure wearing a top hat walking up and down our hallway in the house I grew up in, always at night after my parents had gone to bed. My brother would see the same thing at the same time as me. We had a German Shepherd at the time that would always just randomly start growling and barking right before we would see this shadowy figure. Once my parents split up and my mom moved out, we stopped seeing it. A few years after they split up, I was spending the weekend with my mom at her place, and I saw the figure again standing in the doorway to the room I was sleeping in. I tried talking to it, but it just disappeared. After that night, I would see it from time to time when I was staying with my mom, but had not seen it for about 5 or 6 years. My mom has also since then passed. About 3 years ago, I went to visit my aunt, my mom's sister, in Missouri. We were up one night until like 4 a.m. talking about all our ghost stories, and I mentioned to her how my brother and I used to see the top hat guy, as we called him. She got goosebumps and told me when she lived with my parents before I was born, she used to see him also. She told me that she believed he was my mom's protector, as she grew up in a very rough environment. She told me that when my mom was younger and lived in Massachusetts, she used to have a tall, thin guy that wore a black suit with a top hat follow her around. He always kept a distance, never really gave her a creepy stalker feeling, even though he would always just show up. And ever since my mom passed, no one has seen Top Hat Guy since.